We're now beginning a series of videos giving some specific strategies for greater student engagement. And many of the suggestions I give are going to come from this book, Inspiring Active Learning by Merrill Harmon. There's a second edition of this now available from Amazon, and I highly recommend this because it's very practical. There are some aspects of it that we might disagree with, but when he gets into some specific strategies, he's very helpful. So a lot of this is going to come from that book. One thing that helps with engagement overall is to have a quick-paced lesson. Students are more likely to stay engaged if the lesson keeps moving along at a suitable pace. Now, I'm not just speaking here about talking fast. Instead, it's keeping things moving along so students' attention doesn't lag. Something that commonly slows down the pace of a lesson is for the teacher to keep explaining things to students in slightly different ways. You explain something, then you explain it again in slightly different words, then you say, "Are there any questions?" And if anyone actually says they don't understand, and many students won't say so, but if they do, then you explain it again. But look at what's happening now. The students, hopefully the majority of them, who understood the first time you explained it, they're having to sit through 2 or more re-explanations. That cuts down their energy for learning when they're just mentally marking time. There are other ways to help students who didn't get it the first time, but things that keep the lesson moving along quickly, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But what you want to do is to have a variety of activities, all revolving around learning, but doing it in different ways. And one key outlook here is that you want the students to keep up with your pace instead of slowing the pace down to the slowest student. You need to determine the pace of your lesson, not your students. I know, at first you think, okay, this just isn't going to work. I'm going to have confused kids and I can't just keep marching along when most of them won't know what's going on. What about those kids who are just slower than others? Do I ignore them entirely? Is this just a sink or swim approach? No. Let me give you a couple of examples of what you can do to keep things moving along quickly and keep a quick pace. Here's an example, an action lesson plan. Let's say that you have a lesson that's basically lecture or direct instruction. That is, you have some body of content you need to communicate to the students, whether that's how to divide multi-digit numbers, or a lesson on the temptations of Christ, or the significance of Greek mythology in American culture. Here's what you might do, rather than just lecturing for most of the class period. First, you might have a time of what's called speak right. You lecture or explain until you get to a natural break in the material, but not more than 5 minutes, and this is involving the whole class. Then you have some time to work alone. This is the writing part of it. You'll say, take a moment and write the key ideas you've heard so far or any questions that you might have. Watch the students. When you see that 3 or 4 students have finished writing, say, "One more moment, please." Don't wait for the last student to finish, but pace yourself by the quicker students. Then another speak right series. Continuing lecturing to the next natural break point, then stop and allow them to make some more notes. Continue this sequence as long as appropriate, but not so long that you lose the students' attention. Again, keep an eye on the students to see when they're starting to drift off. Then have sharing pairs. That is, have the students form pairs and share a summary of what they've heard, what they think are the important points or questions they might have. Now, here is where slower students can get their questions answered, either by the paired student or by you as you walk around the room. But again, take note of the class. When you see a few pairs of students finishing up, then call the whole class to wrap up in just a minute. Then you have a lecture summary. Now you summarize the key points for them. Maybe it's the main things they need to remember about the temptations of Christ, or it's the main steps in long division. Notice, again, you're giving some repetition for students who need it, but it cements it in the minds of the students who already have it. But by having some intervening actions, though, you're not just going over the same thing and losing students in the process. Next, attentive discussion. Give them a couple of minutes. Who would be willing to share your ideas or reactions or questions? Again, this is a chance to clarify as needed. The next segment would be outcome sentences. Ask the students to look over their notes or the lesson as a whole and make a note of the key things they learned. It might be something like, I learned that I need to line my numbers up carefully when I do long division. Or it could be a note of other questions they still have. Then, the whip around pass option. You start at one side of the room. Each student goes in turn and quickly reads one of his or her outcome sentences, or they just say, I pass. What's happening here, though, is that the students are again hearing the main points. This time they're hearing it from each other. And you are hearing how well they understand or whether you need to give some individual help later. Now notice, this whole thing that I've structured here takes from 20 to 40 minutes. And you've covered the material you would have covered in maybe 10 or 15 minutes of lecture, but you've also included student interaction, student note-taking, review, answering questions, and clarification. And this is in a fast-paced, quickly moving format. Here's another sample. Start off with cushioning. You want to reduce student anxiety and maximize open-minded attentiveness. So you say something like, we're going to start something new today. Now, don't assume you have to understand it completely right now. We'll review and help each other later, but for now, let's dive in. Then, under-explain. That is, you present the new concept or principle, but you don't try to teach it so every student understands it completely. Just give a quick, succinct explanation. Then, divide up into learning pairs. You say, get together in pairs. Help each other figure out the main points, or say, help each other figure out how to do this. When you both get it, ask each other questions about it. If you're stuck, ask another pair for help. Then, attentive lecture or discussion. Call the whole class back together and say, okay, how did we do? What did you figure out? What questions do you still have? Use discussion or explanation as appropriate, but no longer than whole class attention is maintained. Then, ask a friend. Okay, now you have worksheets in front of you. If you get stuck, ask a friend for help, but go ahead and complete those. Again, notice through this lesson that you're providing help for those who need it, but you're not bogging down the whole class pace for those who need extra explanation. Now, I'm sure you have some concerns at this point. In particular, you may be thinking, I'm just barely covering the material now, and I lecture for 50 minutes straight. When I look at this, I'm only lecturing for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. How in the world am I going to cover everything? Here's where we need to change our mindset. You see, we're not in the business of presenting information to students. We're in the business of helping students learn. Our focus must not be on the teaching end of things, but on the learning end. You see, teaching is just a means to an end. The end is the students learning the material. So if doing things differently means your students learn the material better, even if it's less material than what you've previously taught, wouldn't that be better? See, you can talk a mile a minute and cover a lot of content, but if nobody learns it, what have you accomplished? But there's something else to consider. If you step back and think about your teaching, you'll find that you generally do not present new content for 50 minutes straight. Instead, you present some new content, then you explain it or illustrate it, or you answer student questions about it, or you ask student questions about it, then you present more content. Unless you're teaching in college, you're rarely presenting new material for 50 minutes. You might find out that you actually only have about 20 to 25 minutes worth of new material, with the rest of the time taken up with answering questions, explaining for students who don't understand, and so on. By the way, that's why in a flipped classroom, a lot of times you'll find that you can cover in a 10-minute video the same amount of material you would cover in 30 to 40 minutes of teaching in a live class, because in a live class you're pausing, you're re-explaining, you're answering student questions, whereas in the video you can just do the teaching, just the explanation itself. So what I'm advocating here is that you make a conscious choice to include review, practice, and so on in your lesson itself, and that you do it in a way that keeps the lesson moving along. So there are a few key points now to keep in mind when planning for a quick-paced lesson. One is a mindset on your part, as we've already mentioned, and one which the students will pick up. You need to expect them to keep up with you. Don't try to match the pace they want to follow. If you're waiting for the slowest student or the slower few students to catch up, soon you're going to get dragged down into a pace where you're losing most of the class. Instead, you should be gently but firmly challenging them to work quicker, to keep up with you. Now, I realize, and you need to realize, this is a judgment call. It's possible to move things along quicker than you should, and you don't want to have a Chinese fire drill atmosphere all the time. Okay, it's a judgment call for you. But you should strive for a class pace that keeps the quicker students reasonably moving along, with the slower students working hard to keep up. During this time, you want to observe the class carefully to determine your pace. For example, when you have a small group activity, watch them to see when a few groups have finished up. Then give everybody else just another minute and challenge them to finish up as well. While you're lecturing, observe the class. You can tell by the students' body language and other cues when you're moving to the point of frustration, or when you're losing most of the students because you're too slow, or when they just need to do something different. Specifically, don't wait for the slowest students. I know they're not going to grasp the content as quickly as the faster students, but instead of waiting for them, plan activities in such a way that you can provide them with more explanation and answer their questions without just stopping the whole class progress for that. Notice that the example lesson outlines I gave a few minutes ago include ways to do this. You need to plan this variety of lesson activities. Now, when I talk about activities, I'm not just referring to things where the students are up and moving and doing. A lesson activity might be lecturing, for example, but that's one activity. But the idea here is don't keep doing the same thing for the whole class period. Now, there might be rare exceptions to that. One might be in a science class if you've worked on things for a few days and then you have a lab activity that takes the whole day. But even that, really, when you think about it, involves multiple activities. They're cutting open the frog, they're comparing the organs to the diagram, they're making notes in their lab notebook, and so on. Again, notice that the examples I gave you a few minutes ago included this variety of activities. And you want these activities to be varied in their groupings. Some are going to be whole class activities, such as lecture or note-taking, but also have some small group activities, like discussion groups. Have some individual work, such as having students take a minute to write one question based on the lesson. You want to have a variety of groupings of students. Your language can encourage students to move along quicker by using action words. For example, when you've lectured for a few minutes, say something like, "Now, turn to your partner and summarize the main points of what I just said. Ready? Go." When a few of them has finished, say, "Just a moment more," instead of, "Okay, let's wrap it up in a few minutes." See, just using some action type words like that, like just saying "go," gives them a sense of pace and a sense of working quickly. So you want to use your language that way to give them this sense of urgency, that we have a lot to do, and we need to get busy. So, to wrap up, student engagement will be aided if you have an appropriately quick-paced lesson. Keep things moving along, and you will find that students will stay involved much more effectively.